I welcome you back, my dear friends. Today we are going to discuss our next topic, World War II. We recently discussed three countries, Russia, Soviet Union, Germany, and the United States. So three patterns, three different ways of dealing with the post-war environment. Again, in this case, we're talking about World War I. So in the post-World War I, a lot of countries, a lot of people, they got used to martial methods, mobilization, dictatorships became popular, and as we said, even the most democratic countries, which had a long democratic tradition, they were not immune from the general rule. They also had this fascination with strong personalities, a desire to increase big government, to squash market, and it was natural. A lot of people naturally accepted it. Plus, we mentioned that the settlement of World War I contained the seeds of the future conflict. Okay, and these seeds became visible in how Germany was treated. Remember, Germany was basically mistreated in the wake of the First World War. A lot of Germans hated the Republican government that had been imposed on them by Western powers, and they were looking for revenge. Okay, we discussed National Socialism in Germany, how Adolf Hitler came to power, and how he designed his regime to become an expansionist regime. Okay, the desire to take revenge on the Western countries who humiliated Germany was very strong in Germany. So that is why up to 40% of population, 40% of Germans supported him, and later when he came to power, the rest of society opportunistically sided with him, especially after he started to expand to other countries, hijacking the other countries and robbing their resources and delivering this loot to the Germans. Okay, hence National Socialism, socialism for the Germans only. That was the slogan. Okay, today we are going to discuss how World War II started, how it developed, and what led to the defeat of Germans. Now we're turning to our lecture. First, reviewing what we just said, we need to mention again the goal. Germany wanted to restore her glory and prestige. So, in contrast to World War I, where everybody essentially was responsible, all countries that were fighting each other, now it was Germany that was the initiator, Germany that triggered the whole thing. Although, again, it was not the only one. She was not the only one. There was another country, and we are going to talk about this, another country. Germans wanted to undo the humiliating peace treaty. Okay, plus Hitler was haunted by the specter of the German famine, because at the very end of the First World War, in order to force Germans to surrender, Great Britain and France, they imposed a total blockade, food blockade on Germans. So Germans were not able to trade with other countries to purchase food. As a result, more than 400,000 German children, women, and some men died from this hunger. So Hitler was haunted by this, and he wanted to make sure that it would never happen in future. How to guarantee, to make sure this would not happen in future? You need to expand, you need to hijack or seize more agricultural areas to secure the food base, to secure the agricultural territories for Germany, for the Germans to produce more food. So that is why Hitler talked about so-called Lebensraum, which means living space. And his goal was eventually to expand to Eastern Europe, particularly to Ukraine, to seize this breadbasket of Eastern Europe and to use Ukraine to feed the Germans, to guarantee Germans this food security. Okay. Essentially, it was not only about the food. Of course, food was the major thing. It was also about different types of resources Germans wanted to use. Germans and Hitler, National Socialists, wanted to use to benefit the Germans only. Again, I repeat, that was the message of National Socialism. We need to seize resources of other nations in order to benefit Germans. That was the goal. I also mentioned that step by step, gradually, Hitler started to ignore the stipulations of the peace treaty. At first, he introduced a military draft, which was forbidden by the peace treaty. He reignited the military industry by hiring hundreds of thousands of workers to work at the military factories, which essentially destroyed the unemployment. Remember, one of the important questions which I included into my quiz: did Hitler eliminate the unemployment? Yes, he did. He did eliminate the unemployment. By what? By expanding public works and by giving jobs to Germans at the military factories, the military industry. Then he takes over his native country of Austria. Remember, Hitler originally was an Austrian. He moved to Germany. Then he took over so-called Rhineland. That was the area that had been controlled by France in the wake of the First World War, a coal mining area. Eventually, Germany concluded a peace pact with two friendly nations, Japan and Italy. Okay, and together they decided to fight against France, England, to stop communism and to stop liberalism. That was the goal. The last thing that increased Hitler's appetite was the Munich Agreement of 1938. And again, I want to remind you that formally Hitler was right in this case. He wanted to get united with a small German minority that lived within Czechoslovakia, a newly created country in the wake of the First World War, so-called Sudetenland. 3.5 million Germans who also wanted to be reunited with their brothers and sisters. So Hitler said, I want this area. And France and Great Britain, behind the back of Czechoslovakia, decided to give this area to Hitler. In exchange, they made him sign a paper, an agreement that he wasn't going to attack any other country. And of course, being a dictator who didn't care about treaties and agreements, Hitler immediately violated this promise. As soon as he seized Sudetenland, he rolled on and occupied the entire territory of Czechoslovakia, which was a huge coup, for the biggest coup. Why? Because Czechoslovakia was the #1 country in Europe at that time in terms of military industry. Czechs were very important in interwar Europe, developing automobile industry, tank industry. They were building machine guns. They were building armored cars. So a lot of military industry. So Germans laid their hands on this and used this industrial potential to expand. So it was the license to expand. He felt that nobody could stop him. And finally, he concludes a pact with another brutal dictator, equally vicious, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. Together, these two dictators decided to divide Eastern Europe. Hitler wanted to pacify the Soviet Union in order to attack and defeat Britain. And the Soviet Union also was afraid that the Great Britain and France pushed Hitler to occupy Czechoslovakia in order to force Hitler to attack the Soviet Union. That's what Stalin thought. Okay. Neither Hitler nor Stalin trusted each other, but at the same time they concluded this peace treaty, non-aggression pact, to formally promising that they would not attack each other. That was the formal agreement. But the major thing was the secret protocol included into this non-aggression pact. according to the secret protocol, Germany and Soviet Russia had to receive chunks of land in Eastern Europe. Germany was promised to receive the western part of Poland. Soviet Union was promised to receive the eastern part of Poland. On top of this, Stalin was promised and permitted by Hitler to occupy Baltic countries such as Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and Finland. Okay, so both dictators, brutal dictators, they divide Europe, and here's the map that shows you how this division was made. Okay, if you look carefully at the map, you will see that these areas colored in blue and dark blue were to be occupied by Germany. The areas colored in light brown were to be occupied by the Soviet Union. Okay, and that's what they did in fulfillment of this agreement. And that's when the World War II started. So very important. In fulfillment of this agreement between the Soviet Union and Germany, on September the 1st, I repeat, German troops attacked Poland from the west. Almost simultaneously, a week later, Soviet troops crossed the border of Poland from the east and occupied the eastern part of Poland. In fact, in September, both armies, Red Army and the Nazi Army, met each other, and here they concluded another agreement, so-called Treaty about Border and Friendship. So Hitler and Stalin concluded the second treaty about friendship. So they divided Poland and they marked the border. Okay, so that's when the Second World War started. If you go to history books, you will see that almost all history books tell us that Germany was the one to start the Second World War. And formally it was correct. But hardly any textbook mentions that it was Soviet Union, along with Germany, that was the country that started the Second World War. A week later, Soviet Union attacked Poland, almost simultaneously. Yes, chronologically, Soviets were the second to come, but these two nations invaded Poland and decided to tear apart this country, to squash this country and destroy it completely, to phase out Poland from the face of the earth. And that's when England and France had to step in. They were connected by a peace treaty with Poland, and France declared war on Germany, and then UK declared war on Germany, and they did it immediately after September the 1st, 1939. So since three countries became involved in the war, Poland, UK, and France against Germany, we call it World War. Other countries later joined. But the Soviets were very cunning, smart. They stepped in a week later, so that is why formally, even though they were aggressors, but they kind of stayed out of business. So Stalin was a very cunning person. In my view, it was these two countries that initiated the Second World War, but no history book will tell you about this. Okay, it will always tell you it was Germany only. Okay. Since Hitler easily occupied Poland again, his appetites grew and grew, and in 1940 he rolls on in the west and invades Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, occupies these countries. France, that tried to prepare herself for resistance, was literally overwhelmed, destroyed, surrendered. Hitler occupied the entire territory of France, and French people were so shocked by the motorized invasion of Germans, sudden invasion. They did it so quickly, suddenly. They could not recuperate. They were in a state of shock. So that's how Hitler became the biggest fan of this military tactics called Blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg means lightning strike. So he struck quickly in hope to defeat a nation, and that's how he succeeded. Okay, English troops that were stationed in France, they had to retreat back to England, and Hitler started bombing England. Okay, the war started, severe war between UK and Germany, and England mobilized herself, and she was able to bomb back Germans. Germans retaliated, so great showdown. England was alone against all these resources mobilized by Hitler. So see, he occupied all these countries, and he used resources from all these countries against UK. UK literally was alone, okay, at this point. If those of you who watched movie Dunkirk, that I think it was a year ago, so you go to Netflix or YouTube, or like, you will see some copies of this movie. Dunkirk describes this process of evacuation of English troops from northern France to back to UK, and how Germans harassed these troops. Okay, so Germans mobilized a huge military machine. But now I have to bring something important that explains why Hitler suddenly decided to violate this non-aggression pact between himself and Stalin and attack the Soviet Union. And that's what eventually worked well for the Soviet Union, because Soviet Union turned out to be a victim of this aggression. And eventually, since it came out as one of the winners in the Second World War, so history books don't mention that originally the Stalin's regime, along with Hitler's regime, these countries were the true initiators of the Second World War. Anyway, why did Hitler suddenly decided to attack the Soviet Union? Soviets and Germans had an agreement. They traded with each other. They promised not to attack each other. See, they divided Eastern Europe. In fact, Stalin delivered a lot of oil, grain, supplies to Hitler in exchange for hard currency, in exchange to machines. Okay, but then something happened that changed Hitler's mind. What happened? Russian or Soviet-Finnish Winter War. According to this pact of 1939, the pact I mentioned between Hitler and Stalin, both dictators divided Eastern Europe, and Finland was a country, one of these countries, to be occupied by the Soviets. But lo and behold, Finnish people refused to be occupied. They stubbornly resisted. The tiny country, 7 million people, decided to resist. They organized such a hard resistance that they inflicted the huge, humiliating losses on the Red Army. Okay, so here you can see on this slide a few numbers. Russia lost 120,000 soldiers, mostly to frost bites, to severe hunger, because Red Army was not equipped at this point by the winter clothing, because Stalin thought the occupation would happen quickly, and he didn't provide any supplies. But Finland lost only 20,000. It was so humiliating, and finally Stalin decided not to occupy them. Finns and the Soviets concluded a peace treaty. Yes, Finnish people seceded some borderland territories in Finland. See, these areas were ceded by Finland to the Soviets, where Soviets built military bases here. Finland had to give Soviets a few islands in the Baltic Sea for Soviet military bases. But essentially, Finland was able to survive as a country, which was good. So it was a disaster for Stalin, even though formally he won the war. So he got these territories. It was a humiliating victory. And Hitler was watching this. That is why I'm stepping in, telling you, emphasizing why this war was so important. Hitler was watching this, and he was shocked by the weaknesses of the Red Army. He said, hey, Soviet Union was a colossus on clay legs. It was so weak. Why do I need a peace agreement with these Soviets? I will just roll on. I will get in, occupy them. Soviets seize their resources, Ukraine. I will get the oil in Caucasus Mountains. I will get the coal mining areas in eastern Ukraine. And I will have all resources ready to do what? To attack England and then to go against the United States. And that was his plan. So that is why Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union, suddenly invade the Soviet Union, doing his favorite tactics of Blitzkrieg, lightning strike. So a sudden and unexpected attack against Russia on June 22nd. June 22nd, 1941, Hitler attacked the Soviet Russia suddenly, and in 3 weeks, he was able to occupy a huge area. Look at this area, huge area. He occupied almost entire European part of the Soviet Union, including Ukraine, North Caucasus area, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Belarus, and Central Russia. And he approached Moscow. Only 30 miles away he was from Moscow. 3 million Soviet troops surrendered to Germans. They threw their guns, didn't want to fight for Stalin. That's another thing I would like to emphasize, because unlike Germany, where a majority of Germans supported Hitler because he wanted to do something for Germans, of course, at the expense of the other people, in Soviet Russia, in this brutal dictatorship, society was intimidated into submission. Of course, there were some people, some workers, some communist bureaucrats who lived in cities who supported this regime. But in the countryside, many people hated Stalin, hated communism because of the collectivization, because of many millions of people who died as a result of communist agricultural policies. Remember, we talked about it. Collectivization. When Stalin's regime forced everybody to live on collective farms, they forced everybody to fulfill grain quotas, squeezed grain from people, and even starved to death more than 7 million people. Okay, so there were big groups of people in the Soviet Union who secretly hated the regime, and at the first opportunity, of course, they were ready to betray it. So hence this number, stunning number of POWs, I repeat, 3 million people surrendered to Germans. But unfortunately, Germans had no food to feed them. That is why almost 2 million people of these prisoners died from hunger, because there was no food. Why? Because Hitler actually ordered his army to feed off the land, So I'm not going to provide you. You need to use whatever you find in those areas which you occupy. Remember, Lebensraum, living space. So you have to seize all the food resources, all kinds of things. And that's what they were doing. And they wanted to conserve food. And of course, they didn't have enough food for other populations. So that is why 2 million Soviet POWs died. That is why later 2 million Poles died, because Germans didn't want to feed Poles, especially those who couldn't work. And they literally starved them to death, conserving food for Germans only. And that's, by the way, one of the reasons why Holocaust happened against Jews, because Jews suffered more than any other ethnic group in the Second World War. The major Holocaust, by the way, happened again in Poland, when more than 2 million Jews were killed by starvation and then were gassed in concentration camps because of this brutal policy of Germans who wanted to conserve the food for German soldiers, for German population, and didn't want to share their food with other, they call them unclean nations. That's how they call Slavs, Jews, other nationalities that were not Aryan, not so-called Aryans. Okay, so see, it was a desire to conserve food resources. So 3 million people, Soviet soldiers. Again, it's not exactly correct. I wrote not only Russian soldiers were there. There were many other soldiers from Muslim areas of the Soviet Union, some Ukrainian soldiers, Russian soldiers. 3 million POWs were imprisoned by Germans, and 2 million of them died. Germans almost destroyed the Soviet Union, but then winter came. So Germans actually had to face the same situation that the Soviets had to face during the Soviet-Finnish War. Okay, but at that time, Soviets were negligent because of their own stupidity. They did not supply their army because they thought the victory would be easy. But in this case, in case of Germans, they too believed that victory would be easy and they would be done with the Soviet Union before the first snow came. But unlike the Soviets, Germans didn't have any military equipment to be delivered. Okay, so they had to manufacture it, they had to produce it, they had to purchase it somehow. It was really, really bad. Okay, because they were so reckless. They thought they would win the war before the winter came, but they stretched out their supply lines. They simply didn't have enough resources, didn't have enough manpower to man this area, to control this area. Okay, they only could control big cities, but small towns, the countryside, they couldn't control. So they spread around, and that was it. They could not even organize advance. So the land, the huge territory of the Soviet Union, bad roads, horrible roads. In summer, in autumn, these were roads that were dirty roads. There were hardly any paved roads. But when winter came, so the winter was so severe that all German machines, tanks, trucks, automobiles, tanks, they didn't have enough winter fuel, and they stopped. So Germans had to rely on horses and manpower. It was really brutal. Like if you watch footage on History Channel, you will see that the German front in the east, it was mostly driving horses and relying on the manpower. Okay, it was really bad because all their equipment either drowned in this mud and dirt or stopped because of the lack of winter fuel. Okay, so the Mother Nature started to defeat Germans. It wasn't so much Soviet troops. Okay, the second front was in the Pacific Islands. Here, United States and Japan confronted each other. How it happened? Everybody heard, I'm sure, about so-called Pearl Harbor, when Japan suddenly, again, the same tactics of Blitzkrieg. Japan suddenly, in December of 1949, attacked the United States in Hawaii Island, destroying the American fleet in this area, and killing 3,500 American military men and sailors. Okay, why did they do it? Because original grudge of Japan against the United States was that United States, in an attempt to penalize the Japanese for invading China, in 1931, Japan invaded China, seized the huge area of China, occupied it. Okay, to penalize for this act of aggression, United States said, we are not going to ship you any fuel, no oil, no fuel, nothing, no raw oil, no fuel. So total blockade. And Japan didn't have any oil. So Japan was desperate. Her aviation couldn't fly, airplanes couldn't fly, so the fuel for trucks, for airplanes was rationed. It was really bad, of course. And in an act of revenge, trying to, again, in a lightning strike to defeat the United States, they attacked US in Pearl Harbor, and their long-term strategy was to invade the western coast of the United States and seize these oil fields somewhere, to move further in Texas, in western areas, to seize oil fields. Okay, that was the tactics of Japan. Very stupid and reckless tactics, as stupid as Hitler's desire to occupy this huge monster Soviet Union. So that, again, the Soviet Union, United States, it's a huge land mass. Okay, I remember when we discussed why England was defeated in the U.S. Revolutionary War of 1776. I quoted you one English general who, in desperation, chased the Washington army through the woods. You know, he wasn't able to engage them, actually, so he had to chase him, and by chasing Washington troops, he exhausted his redcoats, and in desperation, he uttered the famous phrase, I quote, "You cannot conquer the map," unquote. And that's exactly what happened with German troops in the Soviet Union, and same thing in Japan. Of course, Japan did not invade the continental United States, but Japan stretched herself enough in this era, occupying Manchuria, Eastern China, Indochina, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and a bunch of Pacific islands. So Japan stretched out herself so bad that it also, like Germany, she had to man all these islands, all these territories with her troops, and that's how she eventually exhausted herself. And not having natural resources, especially fuel, it was clear, by the way, to all attentive observers in 1949, 1942, that Japan and Germany would be defeated. Everybody knew at this time. So I ask you not to buy this popular gimmick when you go to history channels, or if you open some coffee books that say, oh, it's such mighty powers, like Germans, they were such a mighty power. Japan was such a mighty power. No, they were not mighty powers. No, not at all. Germany, for instance, occupying the entire territory, almost entire territory of Europe, didn't have as many resources as the Soviet Union and the United States. Even Soviets, whose territory, Eastern European territory, was occupied by Germans, still had more resources than Germany, and entire fuel supplies of Germans throughout the World War II was only 30% of what the United States and Soviet Union had, you know. So only 30% of what the Soviet Union and the United States could afford, despite the fact that Germans seized a bunch of Soviet tanks. They seized almost 20,000 Soviet tanks through their lightning strike. Thousands of trucks, thousands of cannons, a bunch of rifles, and they used actually this equipment, repainted it, and used this equipment against the Soviets. Same with Japan. They had so few resources, they had so few rifles, so few airplanes. So sometimes it's hard to understand why these two nations decided to be so reckless to attack the Soviet Union on the one hand and the United States on the other hand. But anyway, Japan and Germany got together. They made a military agreement to help each other. Italy was a part of this agreement. Remember, as early as 1936, they made this agreement. And to more or less support Japan, Hitler in December 2 declares war on the United States. And that's how the Soviet Union found this brutal dictatorship, as equally as vicious as Hitler's dictatorship, found herself in the same camp with the United States and England. So since Hitler attacked the Soviet Union says, hey, Stalin says, hey, I'm going to be with you, United States and England. So, and that's how we have, again, two coalitions of countries against each other. On the one hand, Germany, Italy, and Japan. On the other hand, UK, the Soviet Union, and the United States. Okay. The most powerful decision the United States made, it was an act of so-called land lease. Land lease, it was an act adopted by the US Congress to freely provide military supplies and food to her allies. Again, when I said freely, it's not exactly correct. So the countries, allies of the United States, which received these supplies like military equipment and food for the troops, they had to pay partially for these supplies, and the rest of payments were to be delivered after the war, or unused equipment had to be returned back to the United States. Essentially, it was an act of Congress to allow United States to provide allies with unlimited hardware and food, and partially to be partially paid for this for these deliveries. So the allies of the United States were actually expected to partially pay for this. Okay, so that's how the United States delivered millions of tons of hardware, aviation fuel, food to the Soviet army. Like, all Soviet troops were fed by the American canned food. The march of the Soviet army was driven by American trucks. They used American trucks to carry guns, cannons, guns. Americans supplied up to 20% of Soviet tanks. Americans delivered 30% of Soviet airplanes, and the Americans delivered almost entire supply of aviation fuel. Soviets didn't have facilities at first to produce aviation fuel, so Americans delivered this. So they had to do it. Again, the bottom line here was that Americans wanted to save American lives using other countries' manpower resources, helping them by hardware and food, that which allowed them to save American lives. When you compare Eastern Front in Europe, Soviet Union against Germany, and the Pacific Front, where the Americans against Japan, of course, in the East, you will see the magnitude of fights was much wider, okay, than in the Pacific Ocean. In Pacific Ocean, we have like 2,000, 3,000 troops fighting against the same number of Japanese. But in the Soviet-German front, we have millions of people confronting each other, millions of people. Okay, during one battle, which I mentioned in a minute, Stalingrad battle, 2 million Soviet troops surrounded 600,000 German soldiers. It's like amount of people engaged in the fight was outrageously high. So Germany and Japan had very limited resources, despite the fact that they seized some France, Czechoslovakia, and were able to supplement the missing items. The biggest problem Japan and Germany didn't have oil. So the only place where Germany could dig for oil and get oil was Romania. Romania was an ally of the Germans, but they had very small oil fields. Germans were good fighters. The Soviets were able eventually to mobilize a huge army of 15 million people, and the ratio was 5 Soviet soldiers for 1 German soldier. Stalin didn't care about human beings. He literally drowned Germans in human corpses. So American help and unlimited Soviet human resources, that's what won this war. Germany started to quickly lose since January 1942, when a German army was defeated in Stalingrad battle. January 1941, 1942. It was the turning point in the war. As I said here, 600,000 German troops were surrounded by the Soviets, by 2 million Soviets, and that was it. So since then on, Germans were on defensive. They started to retreat. By 1944, Germans were out of Russia. And that's when the United States and UK decided to do so-called DDay. In the Soviet Union, they called the Second Front. Yeah, it literally was a second front. So they decided to invade France in order to fight against Germans from the West. So Germany now had to fight on two fronts: in the east against the Soviets, the major front, and in the west against the Americans and the Brits, who invaded Northern Europe on June the 6th, 1944, in the operation that became known as the D-Day. Okay. And then it was clear that soon the war would be over. May 1945, Hitler commits suicide, Germany surrendered. Okay. So at the very end of the war, when everybody knew already that the defeat of Germany was just a matter of months, even weeks. So allies, Soviets and UK on the one hand, and UK and the United States on the other hand, they already started to size each other. Okay, and what to do after the Second World War? Okay, in 1944, US dropped nuclear bombs on the Japanese cities Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which forced Japan to surrender. Okay, Japanese army surrendered. In fact, Japan was defeated in northern China by the Red Army troops. Okay, they didn't have enough, not only resources, just manpower. So they were quickly defeated, and these nuclear bombs used by US sped up the whole thing. So they had to sign a peace agreement. And Japan was occupied by US troops, as you know. General Douglas MacArthur and his troops invaded Japan, occupied it, and that was it. As there is in the course of the Second World War, the humankind was petrified with two things. People saw how deadly the war could be. Of course, the First World War was brutal enough, poisonous gas and things like that. But the second one also showed that it could be equally brutal. And I would like to single out two things that horrified the humankind. First, Holocaust, when almost 6 million Jews perished. They were slaughtered by Nazi. Okay, and again, the Holocaust became possible mostly because of the war. Okay, at first Germans didn't plan, as I said, they didn't plan to annihilate all the Jews, but the war made it easy, because during the war violence becomes the new normal. Martial attitude, mobilization, so human life doesn't cost anything in the time of war. That is why for Germans it was easy to switch to this total annihilation of Jews. And as I said, in addition to their anti-Semitism, animosity toward Jews, Germans were mostly driven by a desire to conserve their food resources for their own army. So that is why they starved and did this Holocaust. The most horrifying thing, of course, was the gas chambers in concentration camps in Poland. These concentration camps that had gas chambers, they were in Poland. I repeat, Poland was the area used by Germans to do this Holocaust. Sobibor, Auschwitz, these camps existed as killing camps. But another horrible thing that happened with the humankind was the nuclear weapons. Even though the United States used these nuclear bombs to speed up the end of the war, the humankind was literally shocked by the mass destruction that nuclear bombs inflicted. So they realized that it wasn't only the poisonous gas that could kill instantly hundreds of thousands of people, but there was some kind of more potent and horrible energy, nuclear energy, that could destroy hundreds of thousands of people. Okay. In fact, to the present day, there's a debate going on in US among historians in other countries. Was it justified on the part of US to use nuclear bombs or not? Some people say that, Japan was almost defeated. The Soviets defeated them in Manchuria, northeastern China. Americans almost defeated them in the Pacific. What was the point to use the nuclear bomb? Okay. Other historians say, no, it was correct. We were able to save American lives. Okay. The overall result of the war was that more human lives were lost than in the previous war. So we have 30 million people died. After the war, when Hitler was defeated, the former allies immediately started to quarrel with each other. Okay. I would like to stress that in the United States, there was a public opinion very favorable to the Soviets. Okay, they thought, many intellectuals, common people believed that, oh, we would be friends with the Soviets, they would open up themselves. But in Europe, especially in England, people knew better. And United States wanted to know more about the Soviet Union. So how are we going to deal with this country after the war? Are we going to be still allies, or we're going to confront each other? And that's what a new ambassador to the Soviet Union, an American ambassador to the Soviet Union named George Kennan, he was instructed to send to the White House his opinion. So how do you see the post-war relationships between the Soviet Union and the United States? And in response, he sent a long telegram, and that's how it became known, this document called the Long Telegram, where he argued that Soviets were a dictatorship. It was equally brutal dictatorship. Plus, they're very suspicious of the West. They view themselves as the fortress besieged by evil forces like capitalist forces, the Western powers. And Stalin was an old paranoid dictator who doesn't trust the UK and the United States. And unfortunately, he said that in the Soviet elite, they believed there would be an imminent war between the Soviet Union and the West. So we cannot trust these people. Okay. Plus, the mistrust emerged already in 1945, the mistrust of former allies. The allies met 3 times. Leaders of 3 countries met 3 times during the war. In Tehran, Iran, Yalta, Crimean Peninsula in the Soviet Union, and Potsdam in Eastern Germany. The most important conference was Yalta Conference, 1945 in Crimea. That's where Churchill, Prime Minister of UK, FDR, President of the United States, and Stalin, the Soviet dictator, they divided Germany. They decided to divide Germany in the western part to be occupied by UK, France, and US, and Eastern Germany to be under the Soviet control. Berlin, the capital of Germany, was also to be divided in 2 parts. Although Berlin, the capital of Germany, was located in the Soviet zone, Eastern Germany, to be occupied by the Soviets, still the city itself was to be divided between eastern part, Soviet part, and the western part was to be occupied by the French, the English, and American troops. Okay. Another thing, and that's what started animosity between the allies, the Soviet Union on the one hand and UK and US on the other hand. During the Yalta Conference, a decision was made that Stalin promised this, that elections would be conducted in Eastern Europe, those countries which Soviet Union occupied. As you know, that when Soviet Union crossed the borders, its own borders, he occupied Poland, occupied Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, part of Austria, Eastern Germany. And the US and England asked him, could you please promise us that you would conduct free elections in these countries? And Stalin said, yes, of course, I will do free elections. And like Hitler, he was evil. He never wanted to trust his own promises, even though it was a written promise. Okay, so he, instead of allowing people in Eastern Europe to hold free elections, to have free elections, Stalin imposed on these countries his communist puppets. So he planted in each of these countries a communist dictator, his loyal servants. And by doing this, he violated this agreement with the UK and the United States. And that's what was the first spark that ignited this animosity. Okay. And then there was this long telegram, which I mentioned. Okay. So a new period in the history of the world started, the period that became known as the Cold War. And the Cold War is going to be our next topic. Thank you for your attention and see you next time.